Hi folks, and welcome to hemming part 2. In the first video we talked about the basic ways we have to hem garments with either a rolled or a turned hem. And we talked a little bit about fabrics that may not need turning, like selvages and heavily folded wools, things like that. Today I'm going to cover 2 stitch types that we haven't talked about in any of the videos yet that are particularly useful for hemming. We're going to look at blanket stitch and we're going to look at couching. Both blanket stitch and couching can be used alone to secure a hem, or they can be added on afterwards as decoration and reinforcement. We have one item of clothing where both blanket stitch and couching appear on the same garment, and that's the shoulder hem hood. Around the face opening we have couching stitch, and that can be seen as you use the hood just along the edge there. And around the bottom of the hem of the hood was blanket stitch. After that we're going to just recap on a stitch I have already talked about before, and that's a variant of herringbone stitch that was found around a cuff at York. And once that's done, you'll have 3 additional ways to finish off your kit. Lovely. Let's get started. Okay, so the first stitch we're going to look at today is a blanket stitch, also sometimes called a buttonhole stitch. You can see the basic stitch type just here. You get these vertical lines along with a horizontal sort of rope effect along the top there. This type of stitching has been used for thousands of years in different forms. The oldest textile ever found in Denmark, at Ordrup Mose, is a piece of Neolithic netting which uses a twisted version of the buttonhole stitch to create a very different textile. In her book, Ancient Danish Textiles from Bogs and Burials, Margaret Hald also describes other examples of the stitch from the Viking Age. The second example here has an extra thread included. We won't look at that technique today, but we'll stick with the basic stitch, which was also found on 2 hats from our period. The Auslam hat, shown here, had blanket stitch around the back of that neck flap. It was also used to hem each of the pieces of the Lane's pillbox hat before they were sewn together. The edges of the different parts of the hat were first folded double and secured with blanket stitches to prevent fraying. Only then were the parts sewn together using that lovely decorative herringbone stitch we've covered before. Now, I mentioned earlier that the 2 stitch types that we're going to be looking at today were both found on the shoulder hem hood, and that's what I've got here. These are 2 of my shoulder hem hoods that I've made. And you can see the blanket stitching along the edge there. On this one, it's holding in a lining as well. You fold the 2 into each other so the raw edges are all tucked inside, and then blanket stitch along the whole lot. That's one option. The original hood actually had a lot of its edges were left raw. Some of them were selvages, but where the blanket stitch is found, it's actually found along a raw edge rather than a turned edge. Now, I prefer to turn my edges just because I think it provides a little bit more protection, but sewing this stitch along a raw edge is perfectly acceptable. You'll often find it on fabrics that don't fray, things like felt, things like that. Obviously we don't have felt in the Viking Age, but we do have heavily fulled cloth. So a blanket stitch along the edge of a piece of heavily fulled cloth, absolutely perfect. Okay, to make the basic stitch, I'm going to show you on this little scrap here first. Now, if you're working on a selvage edge, you may wish to knot your cord to help start the stitch. What I tend to do is just use that little knot to start it, and then I'll come back and deal with this long end. If you leave the end at least a needle length, then you have enough play just to start tucking this away at the end on your finished piece. For now, to start off your blanket stitch, come up from behind, so you meet your knot. You're going to go round once more into the same hole you've just come out of. And come out of that hole you've just made. Make sure before you pull it tight, just pop back through like that. That's your initial stitch to hold everything in place. Now, to make the blanket stitch, come in through the fabric, up, making sure as you come up, this thread here is underneath, so that when you pull it tight, you have this loop. And that loop action is what's going to give you the line of stitching along the end. So you come straight back out, move along to make your next stitch, go in, up over this thread, and pull it tight, not too tight. If you pull really tight, you skew your stitches off to the side. It can take a little bit of practice to get these stitches nice and even. I must admit I haven't actually done this one for a little while. It's been quite a bit of time since I made my last hood, so just practice on some scrap fabric until you get the hang of it, and it will feel slightly different on your final piece, whatever that may be, however many layers you've got, or if you've turned the edge or not. So you just keep repeating that motion. Into the front of the fabric, coming up with your thread tail behind your needle so that you hook each time. That's just a few of those stitches there. Now I'll show you on a turned hem what this looks like next, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different ways you can hold your hands to do this stitch. This way is probably the easiest, but it won't work for everybody. Some people will find this, ouch, stabbed myself, extremely tricky, and you may want to modify it for what works best for you. So I'll show you a couple of different ways that I do it as well. Okay, so my thread's pre-knotted. What you may wish to do instead is hide your thread tail from the very start in there and just make a tiny stitch right at the bottom in line with where that vertical part there is going to be, so you don't really see it. There's lots of different ways that you can choose to do this. So I'm going to come up from the back, get rid of that clip. Now the first example I showed you was worked along a raw edge. Absolutely fine to use this stitch to work along a raw edge. In fact, as I said, the original shoulder hem hood didn't have a turned edge on it, so that's a perfectly acceptable way to work this stitch. However, if you are working on a turned edge like this, clipping is going to be necessary to keep everything in place. So we make our first stitch all the way around and out the same hole we started with. The moment that loop is free, we're just going to hook it there. Make that our first stitch there. Here's where you swap it round. Going to come in and up. Now, what some people find easier is to switch round and work this way. Catch the thread there with the thumb and work upwards. That's another option for you if you find it a little bit tricky working that other way, but it does mean you need to catch that thread with your thumb each time that it comes through before you make your next stitch, just to keep it in the right position. Now, whichever angle you choose to work this from, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which angle this little ropey bit at the top goes, either is absolutely fine. It's just going to depend on what is best for your hands, if you're left-handed or right-handed, and what feels better to your fingers. So don't worry if you find my two examples there really complicated and awkward. Find your own way. The things that you need to remember are, it's like a whip stitch in that it's going in and out through the back, in the front, out the back, in the front, out the back, over and over. But instead of that spiral motion, you're catching with each stitch the thread from just before. That's going to try and go around the pin, so I'm going to move it forward before I throw it through. So instead of this needle just being off and free and into the next spiral, it's catching that thread there, and that's what makes this a blanket stitch. You can see it can be a little bit tricky at first to get your tensions even. There may be a small amount of frustration while you learn the stitch. It's definitely easier when you're not trying to look through a camera lens and do it, so I'm sorry if it's a bit rubbish today. But you just continue with that motion all the way along. And on this one, as I said, it's a turned edge. You can work this on a double turned edge over linen, which I'll show you in just a moment. Or you can work it on the selvage like we did right at the beginning. I'll just show you a close up here. This is where it's grabbed hold of two different layers. They've both just been folded into the middle, and the blanket stitch has run along both. It's a few years old now and it's held up really, really well. Blanket stitch is quite a nice strong stitch to use, especially if you've got some pretty thread. You can use a blanket stitch as a decorative stitch after you've already sewn the hem down with whip stitch if you wish, but it will very functionally hold down a hem just by itself as well. If you're finding that getting caught on your clips is absolutely doing your head in, this is another option for doing the blanket stitch. It's a little bit slower to work up because there's 2 steps to each one because of how the thread lays. But you're working from the front so you can see what you're doing. You can come through, lay the thread over each time. It's a little bit easier to keep your tension nice this way as well. So it does slow the process down. But if you're finding the first method I showed you, where you're working from that side across, a bit tricky, this one could be for you. So make sure you're coming around your needle and down, and then come through. That's the benefit of that second step. Instead of making it a single, slightly quicker stitch that gets tangled in here, you can do this 2-part motion. Do it that way as well. Now, eventually you're going to run out of thread. So we're going to prematurely end this thread here, just to show you a simple way to sort out your thread changes without it looking too obvious on the right side of the fabric. So when you come to your last stitch, you're going to come through, but instead of looping it, you're going to keep that well out of the way. What you want to do, pull it until it's just about where you think it's going to want to be, about there. Flip over here. Just make a tiny, tiny little anchoring stitch through there. And go through that one, make a little knot. Hide your thread tail away in there. Now we're not going to do that this time because we don't actually need to. So when you come to attach your new piece of thread. Again, tie another little knot just into the seam allowance there if you've got a turned hem. Brilliant. If you haven't, just make another stitch identical over that one to tie into. Now, if you're working on a selvage edge where you haven't got anywhere to hide the tails, leave them fairly long because you can weave them into the back here when you're finished. So you've tied your new piece of thread on, and you're going to come over, hook into there. See where I've come through from the back into that little loop there. Pull all the way up, and you're ready to continue just as you were before. Now, you can see those a little bit because I've come off a little way, but if you get them as closely in line with behind that one as you can, you'll hardly see them, and it won't make a great deal of difference to your fabric. You can entirely anchor it in the seam allowance here. You don't actually need to tie it so it shows through if you've got a turned hem here. So even if it's a single raw edge here, you can just tie into the edge of there and nothing has to show on the outside. I'll show you that again now. So once again, if this thread was very close to running out, I would come in here, pull it through until it's roughly where I think it will sit when it's finished, about there, and then we're going to tie off just into the seam allowance, not through the fabric itself. Making sure that you've got that held very closely so you don't pull it too tight as you're making the knot, because you need that curve there, otherwise you'll end up with a distorted seam. So when you've tied your next piece of thread in, all you're going to do is flip over, come through this loop here, pull it, and you're ready to carry on. You see, that time, because I was thinking about what I was doing, I didn't come through the surface here, so that you can't see any of these stitches, and so you'll have an invisible join. Now if you're using this stitch for a shoulder hem hood, at some point you're going to come to a corner. Now what I've done here is just made a little diagonal stitch into the corner here, so when you get to this last one, instead of trying to make another one right into that corner, go back into that original stitch, make your blanket stitch so that it's just sitting right on that corner there, and then to do the other half you go again back into the same point, come through, get your stitch laying just along the edge there. It's going to want to go to the back, just ease it forward till it's sitting nicely on that edge. Now you can skip this little diagonal stitch entirely if you want to and just do this other corner, it will still hold it just as well. And what you'll often find is that this piece of thread at the back here always pops round to the back anyway. It's entirely up to you how you want to proceed with that. So then once you've turned that corner, you're just going to go back in again, making sure your threads wrap around the needle each time, and carry on in the front, wrap round, come up and through. Now you can see that I'm working this now on a hem that's already been secured with whip stitches. Perfectly acceptable to do that if you wish, but you may want the cleaner look of hemming purely with the blanket stitch. It's entirely up to you. You can see here, that's what the stitch looks like if you work it much closer together, and you can also make it a lot smaller in depth as well. On a double turned hem, where you've turned all the way under right up to this line again, so that you're not just turning a tiny edge, but you've turned the entire thing and encased it with the same width again inside, you can just catch down part of that hem if you wish. You don't have to catch the entire hem if you prefer the look of the shorter stitches here. That's entirely up to you. You can see that same thing on this blanket stitching here. I've just halved the depth of the stitch to make it a little bit neater and smaller. On this one, this is a selvage edge, so it's not going to fray. So for a heavily felted wool or selvage, absolutely fine to do the stitches a lot smaller, and you may prefer the look of that. And at the end of the day, this stitch is mainly decorative. You can also, if you wish, use it over a rolled hem. We talked about these rolled hems in the last video. A blanket stitch over a rolled hem, also a perfectly acceptable use. These will naturally be smaller. They'll be around the width of your roll because you're only going to need to just secure the edge of that roll down. It does give you that extra decorative element along the edge if you wish. Okay, so the second technique I want to talk about today is couching. That's what you can see along the turned edge of the face opening of the shoulder hem hood. I've got two here. There's a slightly different techniques for each one. The first one here, this is a heavily felted wool. It's highly unlikely to fray in any way, shape or form. So what I've done is I've laid a cord along the edge, and then I've finished it with these little horizontal couching stitches here. If you turn it over, this is what you can see on the outside, is these slanting, slightly longer diagonal stitches along the outside of the work. Now, this thread doesn't match terribly well. In a matching thread with a contrasting cord, you could still get this lovely contrast pattern, but it would match more closely on the outside. If you really don't like how that looks, on this one, I've actually used a braid to cover up that stitching. That's one of the 6-strand Headerby braids. So on this one, ever so slightly different. This fabric is much more prone to fraying. So what I've done is I've whip stitched along the edge first of all, and then I've just couched the cord down next to that whip stitching. You don't see the whip stitching around this because that's done before it's all sewn together. It's just whip stitched by itself, then turned so that all the stitches on this side are those slanting ones from the couching. Now what you can choose to do is whip stitch that down like a standard hem and couch afterwards. Or you can use the couching stitch itself as the way to hold down the hem. I'll show you examples of both in just a moment. It's sometimes easier to learn this technique if you start off with a hem that is already secured down. It's entirely up to you, but that's what I would suggest for your first go, just to get the hang of the stitch type, and so that you're not wrangling with clips as you go along. So I've secured that down, I've hidden my thread inside the seam, just done a couple there to start us off. I'm going to show you the technique now. So you can use 1 or 2 threads, it's entirely up to you. For this one, because it's already secured down and it's turned, I'm just using the 1 thread. It doesn't need to be particularly thick or dense to protect this edge because it's turned. So what you're doing with this stitch is essentially a whip stitch, but instead of being a nice smooth spiral like a normal whip stitch is, this one is slightly different. What you're doing is you're doing a horizontal stitch over your laid thread. This is your laid thread here, and you're coming in, if I just move that out of the way, you want to come in just above where you come out. You come out here, so you're going to go back in just above there, and then make a longer diagonal stitch back onto this stitch line here. This is for securing down a couched cord when you're not trying to do the whole hem at once. It's slightly different if you're using this as your hemming stitch. So I'm going to show you this one first. and then we'll do one that's an actual hemming stitch itself rather than just a decoration in a moment. I'm showing you this first so that it's easier to see the pattern of the stitch. So you've come out there, you're going to come across, horizontally across this cord, to there, and then a diagonal, slightly longer stitch back to this line here, just at the edge of your hem. As you go along, you won't need to move the thread out of the way anymore because you'll get the hang of it. It's straight across there, back up there. So we've done a few of those now. If we turn it over, what you see on the other side is what looks like whip stitching. It's identical on this side, except these are slightly more elongated than your average whip stitch, because with your average whip stitch you're going up, down in a zigzag, and you only see one half of the zigzag, so they're more equal, whereas these will have smaller gaps here and slightly more elongated stitches there, and that's what allows you to get that sort of right angled effect there. Okay, now if you're using your couching method to secure your hem down, so with no other hemming stitches involved, things are a little bit different. What I often do if I'm making a hem like this is I double up my thread. I use 2 instead of 1. I just feel like it gives a little bit of extra protection to that raw edge. So to fix it, I double up my thread like so, make sure I've got enough to do the entire run so that I don't have to change this couch thread at any point during the run. What I'm going to do first of all is just fix that to this turn seam allowance. Just that little bit there, so that that end isn't going to go anywhere. Little knot there to start us off. When we turn over, we've not got to worry about keeping hold of both ends of the couch thread while we do our initial stitches. So what you're going to find with this one is that instead of laying the thread down by the edge and just going along here, we need to catch this turned edge to secure it down as we go. So our stitches are going to be a slightly different profile to what we had before. Now when I lay my threads down, I like to try and get one flat against the base fabric and one just on top of that raw edge, because that will seal that really well inside and protect it nicely. So I'm just going to move my clip into place there just as I start to hold it. Get everything where I want it. And then I'm going to start off. You might find this first bit's a little bit tricky. Persevere, it will be okay. So once you've secured your thread just there, you're going to make your first stitch will be slightly diagonal, and then we're going to do just as we did before, come straight across and then a slightly longer diagonal stitch, but this time we're making sure that we're catching this raw edge of the fabric as we go. So we've got our first vertical stitch there. Now let's pop our second one in. Go straight across up from that where that stitch comes out there. Diagonally, like a whip stitch now, catching that raw edge of the fabric with the cords in place. Make sure you're happy with everything and that the cord is nicely tensioned. You don't want to be putting tension on it as such, but you don't want it bunching up either. So bring your working thread back, ready to make your next stitch. Lay your couched thread where you want it, just pinch it with your nail to keep it in place while you make the stitch. Diagonally across once you've gone in. Now, I've missed a tiny bit of that one there. Doesn't matter as long as we secure it down well with the next one. And we continue in that fashion. Now it's really hard for me to do this bent over in front of a camera, so I'm going to do a few more and then I'll come back and talk to you again in a moment. Okay, so you can see that we've done a few more along there. Now, what you want to do as you're going along is just make sure that this raw edge that's under here is always underneath as you're doing your stitches. Try and keep it nice and regular. You can use your thumb and your fingers to keep everything in line as you go along. As long as you've got this basic pattern of straight across and then a diagonal for the next one, you're going to be absolutely fine. Just check with each stitch you're catching enough of that fabric. And there we have it. We've got our cord couched down, covering that hem. Now you can see there, this is what you want to avoid. What I've done there is I've not come back far enough and I've missed catching that down, so that that's only attached to the back fabric. Now, on a fabric like this, it would matter. I'd need to go back in and repair that somehow. Should have noticed it as I was going along, but I didn't in this occasion, so I just go in and pop a little yellow stitch in there, hide the thread tails in the middle just to keep that secure. When you flip it over, we've got what looks like a whip stitch on the outside, just a bit bigger. And again, if you had a thread, if you used your sewing thread and made it match your fabric, you wouldn't see those very much at all. Or if you were unhappy with that, you could add a braid over the top of it to cover it up. That's also an option. So there we have our two couched hems. We've got our purely decorative one there, and then we've got our more functional one along there. Now, the qualities of the fabric that you're using are going to change how deep you need to make these stitches. You just need to judge that depending on what it is you're making and what you're making it with. If we come back to the inside of the hood here, you can see that this also secures a lining as well. I tend to line my woolen hoods. The original wasn't lined, however, for me and my feelings about wool next to my skin, a lining is necessary for me. So you can also catch down that lining and secure it all together with that couching stitch, as I've done on this one here. And that's held up really well to about 4 years of use now. Okay, the third technique that I want to talk about today is a variant of herringbone. Now, we talked about herringbone stitch used for hemming in the last video, where it's used to secure down a simple turned hem. Now, the type of herringbone that I want to talk about today is a very unusual variant, and it looks a little bit like this when it's done. You can see along the top here, that gorgeous fine plait shape there. Very unusual. As far as I know, we only have one find of it. This technique can be worked over a folded edge, as it is here, or it can be worked over a raw edge as well. You can use it in all sorts of places. I've used it here along the keyhole slit of this neckline. That's going to protect that really, really well. You can encase the entire turned edge if you have a turned edge, or you can just do a very thin line down the edge here. The original was found in the excavation at 28 to 29 High Ousegate at York, and there it was found on what's believed to be a cuff. It's a really closely worked variant of herringbone, a sort of looping stitch, similar to the one from the Lean's cap. Alexandra Lester Makin discusses this in her book The Lost Art of the Anglo-Saxon World. We know that the Anglo-Saxons had a well-developed embroidery skill set. It's thought that a lot of the complex herringbone stitchwork found in Scandinavia could have been imports from Britain, so the technique has a strong connection to the Anglo-Saxon world. So if you're thinking of using it, I would say use it in a situation where you have a tie to England, either through trade or because you are a Viking Age person living in England at that time. It's probably the best use for this stitch. Now, this type of stitching is unusual and it does take quite a long time to work up, but it remains an option either as a hemming stitch over a raw or folded edge, so you can use it on its own as a hemming stitch, or apply it after hemming as an additional protection and decoration. And you can see just there the plait-like structure of the top of this stitch. That sort of slightly V-shaped pattern is common to both of the more complex types of herringbone that we have, and is also seen in wire work, more often in Sweden than in the Western Viking world. However, this kind of looping is very popular as a decorative element. And there we go, 3 more ways that you can use to hem your Viking Age garments. I really hope you found this video helpful. If you have, please pop me a like, because it lets me know that what I'm doing is working well for you and it makes me do the happy dance. Anyway, if you've got any comments or questions, please pop them down there or come find me on Facebook for a chat. Now, I'm currently working on a video I'm really excited about. It's going to take a little bit longer to do, but I think it'll be worth the wait. So all of you, take care of yourselves, happy hemming, and I will see you soon. Bye.